Hey, hello. My name is Lisa Budney. I'm the Collections and Museums Administrator for the Department of Earth and Atmospheric Sciences. Before we begin, I'd like to acknowledge that the museums are located on Treaty 6 territory, the traditional lands of the First Nations, Métis, and Inuit people. Being a custodian of museum collections, I am aware that we are holding objects from Indigenous peoples' lands from around the world. And that's something I'm working at learning more about and seeing how it can fit in with my Truth and Reconciliation journey. So today, we are going to explore the Palaeontology Museum. So a bit about what I do first. As a collection and museums administrator, I take care of 5 of the permanent museum collections at the University of Alberta. The University of Alberta has a total of 29 museum collections, everything from parasites to clothing to cultural artifacts to fossils and rocks. The 5 I take care of are first the oldest collection on campus, the Mineralogy and Petrology collection, so that's minerals and rocks, meteorites, rocks from space, drill core, and that's the core of rock that we drill when we're exploring for resources, or if we want to learn more about the geology beneath our feet. We have 4 kilometers of drill core, as well as the 2 collections we are going to see in here, the invertebrate paleontology collection, that's animals without backbones, as well as trace fossils. And we'll talk a bit about what those are in a bit. In this museum, we'll also see fossils from the Laboratory for Vertebrate Paleontology collection. Okay, so what I'm going to focus on today are highlights from the collection. As we go along, there will be links put into the chat so that you can explore the collection through our virtual tour. You can learn more about when our open hours are. Generally, we're open Monday, Wednesday, Fridays, but please check our website to make sure that we're open the day that you'd like to come. And yeah, we'll get started. The first thing people ask me when they come here is, what is this? Okay, this is Dunkleosteus. It's the head of an armored fish. And this fossil, Beastie, was around, well, it wasn't a fossil at the time, this Beastie was around from about 360 million years ago to 380 million years ago. And as an armored fish, it had these big head plates and these jaws with special features that allowed them to do some really good chomping. The fish itself would be about 10 meters long, so it's quite a long animal. And this animal had the strongest bite force until T-Rex came about hundreds of millions of years later. And what's special about this guy, well, this fossil to University of Alberta, is one of my colleagues who works in my department as part of his studies. He made a model, mechanical model of the jaw so that they could calculate the jaw force on Dunkleosteus. So that's a pretty neat, unique to U Alberta story. Before we explore more, let's make sure everybody knows what a fossil is. We're going to spend some time here. Okay, so a fossil is any evidence of ancient life. So it could be something like this dinosaur bone, which is made of the mineral apatite. And apatite is the same mineral that makes up our bones and teeth. There's a dinosaur tooth right there, also made of apatite. Okay, creatures with shells can become fossils. This is usually the mineral aragonite, but it often alters to calcite. Petrified wood is an example of a type of fossilization. Leaves are rarer to find in the fossil record, and they are very delicate and tend to biodegrade real quickly, right? And this one here is preserved in carbon. Okay, that's one of the building blocks of life, which are carbon, hydrogen, oxygen, nitrogen. Yep, so those are harder to preserve. The last one we'll talk about in this little corner are beetle wings. Okay, that's an example of beetle wings from the Red Deer River Valley. It's rare to find insect fossils, no matter where you are in the globe. You need really exceptional preservation conditions in order to preserve them. The last one, some of those were invertebrates, so the shells, the insects, invertebrates. Another invertebrate are horseshoe crabs. Okay. So if I had a horseshoe crab fossil, this is the shell of a living one. If I had fossil horseshoe crabs, they would be part of my invertebrate paleontology collection. these are a trackway. So these are footprints of a horseshoe crab. This is a trace fossil. So this would belong in my trace fossil collection. So if you think of footprints, burrows, those are trace fossils and are considered fossils because they're evidence of past life. Okay, so my museum, when you come to visit, is organized life through time. So over by the door, you're going to see the oldest fossils in the collection. As you wrap around, you go younger. And today we're going to start with the oldest fossil in my collection. Okay, the oldest fossil that we have from Alberta is 1.4 billion years old. It's called a stromatolite. Stromatolites are important creatures to the planet because they are responsible for putting the oxygen in the atmosphere that we still breathe today. How did they do that? They were photosynthetic bacteria. So they got their energy from the sun, and they gave off oxygen as part of their metabolic process. So they're very special. How do we get fossils of bacteria? Well, you don't see individual bacteria, you see evidence of their lifestyle. So bacteria can live in microbial mats. So if you think of near a lake shore or anywhere where there's still water, you're going to find stuff growing on the sediment. And it tends to be like a sticky mat. Sometimes it's really slippery, okay? There you can find photosynthetic bacteria and other things that like to live in those kind of zones, okay? And over time, though, these things aren't moving around, right? And so they'll get covered with sediment, and then new bacteria will colonize it. So you end up getting layers of microbial mat sediment, and if that turns into rock, you get this stromatolite structure. Sometimes they're bumpy, like these ones here, and they create mound shapes. But what's critical to identifying them are these thin layers, okay? And so this one here is from Wyoming in the United States. This one is more than 2.6 billion years old. Stromatolites are really old, like they go back to 3.5, 3.7 billion years old. So yeah, critical important fossils. For a long time, everything was single-celled. There were no hard parts. And the first creatures that had multiple cells came from the Ediacaran period, okay? So from about 542 to 635, million years ago, we're starting to see evidence of multicellular life in impressions. So these are like body footprints, okay? And so there's no hard parts here. These animals didn't have hard parts. There's very limited information you can get out of these, which make them a little bit of a challenge to study, okay? We're gonna pop into the Trilobite room and look at some of the most abundant fossils in the collections. Okay, what's the most common fossil in my collection? It's probably going, in terms of really high quality stuff, it's going to be trilobites. And trilobites were ancient marine creatures. These are arthropods, so they're related to insects and crustaceans. And like their name suggests, trilobite, trilobe. So this is one lobe, there's a central lobe, and there's another lobe there. So they're trilobed. And the soft body parts animal didn't live inside this shell. Most of the body parts were under it, kind of like in a horseshoe crab. They were the first animals to have a compound eye. I don't know if you can focus in and see on that. But compound eyes are the same kind of eyes that insects that have. Usually if you think of a dragonfly eye, it's a great example of a compound eye. Okay. We have so many trilobites in our collection because they're very good fossils for helping us date rock layers of interest. And they are also the main study animal for a professor who was on campus from the 1970s to the 2010s. So he and his students have named over 150 different species of trilobites, and they were very fortunate to be connected to great trilobite collectors in Morocco, which is where this specimen is from. And we have the finest collection of Moroccan trilobites from the Devonian in the world. So they're a very special collection. And I am pleased to report that you can learn more about trilobites whether you come here for a visit or not. So as of yesterday, if you look on my my collections and museum site, the chat will have the link in it. You can explore a treasury of trilobites, and it gives you an opportunity to see over 100 trilobites up close. You can see a molting video to watch a trilobite grow, and you can do 3D puzzles as well. So it's a really fun site. Check it out. There's a story that hit the news recently. The Alberta government is putting in legislation to declare Ammonite the official gemstone of Alberta. And I do have Ammonite fossils in my collection. Settlers have been aware of Ammonite since at least 1907 in our scientific publications. But First Nations peoples, Treaty 7 peoples have known about it for generations before that. Okay, Ammonite is a gemstone. Come have a look. It's a gemstone that has a real play of colors, so you can see all the colors of the rainbow. And as you go back and forth, the color keeps changing. That tells us that the property has to do with the crystallization and form of the shell, and it's not a real color that's in the, it's not a pigment, okay, like melanin in our skin is a pigment and it has a color. This is an optical property, okay? And how this works, if we look at this diagram, we can get the science behind it. The shell layer of ammonites with ammonite have a mix of protein layer, aragonite mineral layer, protein aragonite, and as light interacts it and bounces back, we can get the different colors of the rainbow that we can see with our eyes, okay? Ammonite is rare. It's only found in southeastern Alberta in the entire world, okay? A bit creeps into Montana, but in terms of quality gemstones, it's Alberta only. So if you find ammonite in a store someplace to buy, which you can buy, it has come from Alberta. So it's like the rarest gemstone in Alberta, in the world. This kind of piece is something that would be kept whole and sold as is. Smaller bits, like this, would be broken down and used to make these kind of pendants. The shell material is really brittle, right? And because it's a fossil, the shell has been subjected to all kinds of history, and it can get cracked and broken up. To prepare them to be gemstones, they're mounted on an epoxy or some kind of resin, which helps stabilize the back. And then the shell itself is impregnated with something to stabilize and fill the cracks as well. Ammonite is soft, okay? It only has a hardness of 3. Diamond is 10. 3 is pretty soft. The salt in your salt shaker is 3 as well, okay? So when you buy jewelry, it's often capped with the P supports, which has a hardness of 7, which protects it from scratching. So there's a lot of preparation that needs to take place there. There are only 2 species of coiled ammonites and 1 species of cone-shaped ammonites for which we can find ammonite. So ammonite is the animal. It's a mollusk, so if you can imagine that there's a squid hanging out here, that's an ammonite animal. They're really fast, they're predators, they eat fish and other invertebrates, and were around for hundreds of millions of years. These went extinct at the end of the time of the dinosaurs. Ammonite comes from ammonites that are 72 to 75 million years old. Okay, this is actually, you only find it if the preservation techniques are right. This is the same species of ammonite that ammonite comes from, but this is more of a typical shell, okay? So the white stuff is calcite mineral. When the shell is rubbed off, you see the little internal structure of the shell, all that leaf stuff, and that's more typical of what you find, okay? What's unique about the preservation is it's thought it has to do with the unique pressure conditions. And these guys become, well, they're not guys, these animals become the nucleus, and around it mineralization happens, and you end up with the specimen completely surrounded by ironstone. So you don't find these out in nature that often. You find these ironstones. You crack open the ironstone, open it up, and the gemstone is inside. So this is very exciting for Alberta. It's a very appropriate choice for a provincial gemstone. We have other materials that are provincial stones. This is petrified wood from different gravel pits in Alberta, and it's the province's provincial stone. Another organic gemstone that we have, and not in commercial quality here in Alberta, but this is an example of amber. and that's fossil tree resin. The only other organic gemstone is opal. Not opal, pearl. Sorry, it's a pearl. Opal is a replacement thing, so it's still considered a mineral. So now we're going to go out and talk about exceptional preservation from the Cambrian, which is the same time when Trilobites first started. Okay. When you visit a museum, oftentimes you find specimens from other collections, okay? Because we share specimens, especially we have lots of them, and it helps us be able to tell more complete stories of the history of life. These are fossils from the Burgess Shale. Some of these fossils were given to us by the Royal Ontario Museum. What's special about the Burgess Shale is that it preserves soft-bodied parts that you don't usually find in the fossil record. So these are some trilobite distant relatives. These are also arthropods, okay? And what's special, like if you look at this one, you can see soft parts, the dark organic-y type stuff in the front of the head there. It's going to be related to organs. Down at the bottom here, we have an acorn worm. Acorn worms are still around today. This one here is banana-shaped. They are banana-shaped. And yeah, it's a completely soft-bodied fossil. Very rare. We can find these fossils near Field, British Columbia in Yoho National Park. There are similar deposits on Monarch Mountain here in Alberta, and there are a few other places in that general area as you go between Field to where the Monarch Mountain is. But the fossils aren't as great as they are at the Burgess Shale. By this time period, the Cambrian, which is about 541 million years ago to about 490 million years ago, we have all major groups of life that are around today, minus vertebrates. So it's all invertebrates. But if you think of sponges, urchins, worms, mollusks like snails and squids and stuff like that, they all had relatives around at this time. Corals too. Okay, spectacular time. So we're just going to turn around and look at the specimens in this case. This is the first of many fish that we're going to see. These are jawless fishes. Most of them are from northern Canada. Okay, and they have kind of like that same head shield thing going on like we saw in the Dunkleosteus. We're going to look in this case here, and we see more fish. These are jawed fishes, okay? So before we had jaws like we do today, we had jawless fishes, okay? This guy here, or this fossil here, is a relative of fossil sharks. Well, not of fossil sharks, of sharks in general. And we have superb fish collections because of the activities of Dr. Mark Wilson, who used to work in biological sciences. He's retired now. And he was interested in the evolution of fish right from their beginnings as jawless fish all the way up to more recent times, because he was interested in the relationships between the different groups of fishes. So I would say that our collection of breadth of fish is quite good for a university collection. Okay, so that's a bit more about our fish and why you'll still keep seeing fish. Don't worry about it. People often ask me, well, how do we know by looking at an extinct animal how it lived, what it is, what it ate? Let's talk about that using this one as an example. This is a cast, it's not a real fossil, of an animal called Eriops. Eriops was an amphibian. It needed to keep its skin wet, and it sort of had to live near water. How do I know it's an amphibian? I know it's an amphibian because by looking at the bones, it has bones in common with all other amphibians. Okay, so that's how paleontologists figure out what group it belongs to. Now, let's figure out, so since it's an amphibian, we have to know it has to live in water. So does it swim all the time, or can it walk on land? Let's take a look at those feet. So the feet of Eriops are spread out, kind of like snowshoes. So that's a clue to us that it could walk on muddy substrates, so muddy land. And when you look at that head, take a look at where the eyes are towards the back of the skull and the nostrils towards the front of the skull. Those positions are good for keeping most of your body underwater, and then just with your eyes and your nostrils sticking above water. So if you're a predator looking for prey to eat and want to sneak up on them, that's a great adaptation. Or if there are predators around and you want to hide from your predators, that's a great adaptation for that too. Okay, so that's a bit about how paleontologists figure this out. This is a fossil cast, so it's not a real fossil. Most of the fossils you find in my collections and in the museum are real, and as time is going on, more museums are using fossil casts. Well, they're not fossil casts, but replicas of creatures and plants and other things. So this is a great spot to come and see real fossils. So what we're going to do now is we're going to take a little break. I'm going to get a drink of water while we have some questions come in.
So one of our attendees asked, how many fossils are in the museum?
Thank you for that question, because I forgot to mention it in my introduction, and it's a huge number. We have over 2 million fossils just in the invertebrate paleontology collection. In terms of vertebrates, it's well over 40,000 now. Okay, why do I have so many? Okay, most of them come from petroleum exploration companies, and that's at least 1 million of them. So the petroleum exploration companies, when they were doing their geologic mapping, they'd traipse across the landscape where they find fossils, they'd grab a bag and grab some fossils, put them in a bag, send them back for paleontologists to identify. This helped us identify rock layers of interest when we were looking for resources. When they no longer needed these specimens, they were given to the university, and that's the bulk of our collection. All of the really good stuff are in special cabinets, and they're organized by life through time, which is really handy. And we call that a biostratigraphic collection. We have one of those upstairs here, and those are very useful for just getting a sense of what life was like through time and to have really high quality reference samples. Some of the stuff, when I look at it in the bags, you can hardly tell that there's a fossil there. You have to be an expert for sure in that particular group. But yeah, over 2 million.
Okay, we have another question. What is the biggest fossil you have?
The biggest fossil that I have is going to be, I have this big tree stump. It's out at another building, and it probably fills up this down to the floor. It's really heavy. We're going to see another big fossil tree stump in the museum, which is big too. Most of my specimens are quite small. So invertebrate fossils tend to be smaller, and they're shelled creatures and things like that. That Ammonite fossil that we saw already is one of the bigger ones in my collection too.
Okay. So we have another question. How many dinosaur bones are in the museum?
Dinosaur bones in particular, I don't know the answer for that. I'm not responsible for that collection. You'd want to contact one of the dinosaur curators, either Dr. Phil Corey or maybe Dr. Corbin Sullivan could help you out with that one.
Okay. And do we have any big dinosaurs like the T-Rex?
We do have bits and pieces of different Tyrannosaurid dinosaurs, big dinosaurs, and from other groups of dinosaurs. But yeah, I'm less familiar with those. I know the last one I remember seeing is there's a big Tarbosaurus cast, and it's quite impressive when you're moving it around. But yeah, okay. So we'll get motoring on to the next station. I'm just going to take a drink. We're going to come over here. We're getting younger in time, so to let you know where we're at, when we saw that Euryalps, it's from a time just before the biggest mass extinction in the world's history, and that happened 250 million years ago. It's called the Great Dying. At that time, it's thought that 96% of the species on the planet went extinct. And so that is called the Proterozoic. Now we've entered the Mesozoic, middle time. Okay, and in the Mesozoic, we're starting to see groups we're more familiar with. We're starting to see amphibians that are around today, that have relatives today, like frogs and salamanders. We're seeing reptiles that are on land and in the water that we see around today during the Mesozoic. And the fish that we see, ray-finned fishes, become more common, and they have relatives around today. And we're going to talk about one of those animals that's still around today. We'll talk about what a living fossil is. Here's an example of a living fossil. Okay, this is a coelacanth relative. Okay, coelacanths were thought to be extinct until about 1938, when somebody who was fishing off the coast of Africa discovered a coelacanth in the market. And it gained attention from the scientific community. And sure enough, when people went to explore the depths of the area, they were finding where coelacanths were found. Okay, and so that's called a living fossil. Turtles are another example of living fossils. I'm going to show you a ginkgo in a minute, and it's an example of a living fossil, so I'll probably use that word more than once. Okay. Here's another example of an animal that we can look at and use clues to help us figure out how it lived. Okay, this is an ichthyosaur, and it's one of the marine reptiles. Marine reptiles, there used to be many different groups. So if you've heard of mosasaurs, ichthyosaurs, plesiosaurs, agialosaurs, champsosaurs, these are all different groups of marine reptiles. The only group that's around today, crocodilians, crocodiles, alligators, gavialids, that's it. Okay, so what makes this one unique and how did it live? It's kind of shaped like a dolphin, and we know that's a great shape for swimming, so it's probably a good swimmer. Let's look at the paddles. We know it's definitely not a mammal because its paddles are made up of little tiny disc bones. If you look in a mammal's dolphin fin, you see bone, finger bones, just like we have. Okay, so it definitely can't be a mammal. It has to be one of those marine reptiles. The combination of the bony features here tell me it's an ichthyosaur for sure, like those disc-shaped vertebrae. Disc-shaped vertebrae can kind of tell you that it's a marine creature. The rock around it tells you that it's a marine setting too. So lastly, let's talk about what it ate. Let's look at these teeth. The teeth are pointy cones, but like really narrow cones. That kind of tooth is great for eating fish. And it doesn't matter what kind of animal group you're in, if you have pointy cone-shaped teeth, you're probably eating fish. That's a great clue. So there you go, ichthyosaur, look like a dolphin, eat fish. Good swimmers. So this is from around the Jurassic time. So Jurassic Park has been around for a long time, and they keep pumping movies out. Sometimes the right dinosaurs in the film are right for the time period, sometimes they're not. Okay, so dinosaurs came about 145 million years ago. By the time we hit the Jurassic, most of the major groups that you think of are around. The Tyrannosaurs are actually relative latecomers, so we'll see them later as we're moving our way around the museum. In terms of Triassic and Jurassic materials, there are no dinosaurs from that age in Alberta rock. Okay, Alberta was covered with water for most of the past billion years, and ocean water. So we're going to expect to find ocean fossils for most of the past billion years. Okay, so that's why we haven't seen any dinosaurs yet, even though we're around them at this time. You've now seen a range of how I have my fossils, like who gave them to us. We talked about Dr. Wilson and Dr. Chatterton, the trilobites in the fish. These were collected by researchers. When we look at something like this one, this is a specimen that came from England. Okay, so either, I don't know the history of the specimen, it's in the Burke Paleo collection. If I looked, I should find a note that either we purchased it or it was donated by somebody. It's possible that somebody went on a dig to collect this one. But yeah, I find all of those in my collection. Donations, purchases. As time has gone on, it's less likely to be a purchase. The trade in fossils has become more strict as we value them for scientific rather than economic purposes. Okay. The biggest time period in the museum covers this entire region. It's the Cretaceous. So the Cretaceous extended from about 66 million years ago to about 146 million years ago. And we have a lot of rock from that time period in Alberta. That makes us unique. So why do we have so much rock from that time period? We have rock from that time period because of the geography and the geology of the landscape at that time. During the Cretaceous, we had mountains to the west, like we do today. We had a seaway running through the center of the province. It was warmer and wetter, so we had lots of rivers, we had lots of wildlife, and those eroding mountains to the west were providing sediment for quick burial. Rivers are great for burying things quickly, and like any waterways. We also had a depression in the landscape to the east of those Rockies, because as the mountains are building, they're pressing on the land and creating a depression. So there's lots of what we call accommodation space for filling up with sediment. Okay, so we ended up with a thick package of fossil-bearing rocks. What's critical as to why we still have those big, thick package of rocks is when glaciation happened in the past million and a half years, repeated glaciations, the glaciers didn't scrape down far enough to move that Cretaceous walkway. So if you go to the Canadian Shield, a lot of the younger rock is gone. There were probably dinosaurs there, but they don't have it in their fossil records. It's very spotty. So Alberta's lucky that way. So let's look at some of the Alberta Cretaceous fossils. We're going to turn around and look at this big fossil tree stump, and it's better to come over here to have a view. This is a great citizen scientist story. So a few years ago, there were people canoeing on the North Saskatchewan, and they found this fossil tree stump near the shores of the river. Okay, they contacted the University of Alberta and asked if we wanted to collect it. It's not something we were able to do, but they wanted to collect it. So they contacted the Royal Tyrrell Museum and asked about what was going to be required, and between the U Alberta and the Royal Tyrrell Museum, it was determined that because the rock that was bearing this fossil was not in position anymore, that it wouldn't be illegal to collect it. Okay, if a fossil is within its rock layer, you can't take it out. You have to contact a scientist and a museum, and if they're interested, they will come collect it. If you're on public land, but not like a parkland, and you find a fossil just on the surface, you can collect it. It still belongs to the people of Alberta, but you can hold on to it. It's a good idea to contact museums anyways when you find fossils, because you might be finding something important. And so in the past couple of years, people have found ancient mammal fossils in different ravines in Edmonton. And sure enough, when I contact my colleague and put them in connection with somebody at the Royal Alberta Museum, these turn out to be something that the museum is interested in learning more about. So it's always a good idea to contact the museum if you find something of interest. Let's talk about the stump itself. Around its base, you see coal. Okay, the stump itself is preserved in silica. Okay, so this is a kind of a harder fossil to study because the original cell texture has been altered quite a bit in most parts. In order to figure out what kind of stump it is, we took this special core. So we used a circular drill bit, made a core, and then we made a fossil thin section. So you can see the cell structure here. That gives us clues as to what group it belongs to. It's an evergreen tree or a conifer. At that time in Edmonton, we had big trees like John redwood and cypress, and so it's likely one of those or a relative of one of those. Okay, and what else did we find out? We took a sample. We took a sample from down here. Oh, sorry. We took a sample from down here, and we found out that there was pollen in there. But the pollen only comes from ferns, which have hundreds of millions of years history, and that didn't help us date the rock. Usually pollen is a good index fossil, like those trilobites, it helped us date the age layers, but there weren't informative spores in there, so we couldn't tell, or seeds or anything like that, that would help pollen spores. No, pollen is pollen, spores are spores. But yeah, there wasn't that good information in there. We do know, because of the age of the rock layers around it, that it's about 69 to 74 million years old. So great citizen scientist story. You can find information about this story online, and it was even part of a radio program. So at the University of Alberta, we have researchers who do study marine reptiles. Here's an example of a mosasaur. This is certainly not the best mosasaur in our collection. You'll notice it has teeth that are different than the ichthyosaur though, right? These are more curved, kind of like a snake, okay? And they're also good for eating ocean creatures. Okay. Inside the other room, we talked about Ammonite, right? And I mentioned that it can sometimes be found in cone-shaped ammonites. If you look down here, here's an example of one of those cone-shaped ammonites. So it's not a nice cone, it's a compressed cone. Why a compressed cone? And even the disc-shaped ones are squished too. That's important for being efficient in swimming. So if you model these shapes with plasticine, which is an activity I would do with grade 6 girls in the past, and we moved them in water tubs, you can see that a compressed cone moves back and forth in the water with less disturbance of the water, so it's more efficient. And same thing with the disc. If you try to turn a disc that's really round, you create a lot of disturbance, and it's not a very efficient swimming shape. The flattened disc is more efficient. Okay, so these were definitely great swimming creatures and had shell shape to help them do that. Okay, in Alberta, flying over the ancient Cretaceous seaways were pterosaurs. So this is an example of a Pteranodon. Its skull is up here. And then you have its wing bones. Wow. And its little spindly legs that are pretty wimpy, so you know it wasn't walking around anywhere on the land. And yeah, pterosaur fossils are really hard to find. Okay, so these are animals that were living near shorelines, and they were hunting. Their bones are quite delicate, and they don't preserve well. This one comes from the Kansas Chalk in Kansas, and it was actually collected by researchers here by the first vertebrate paleontologist, Dr. Dick Fox, and longtime technician, Mr. Alan Lindo. So it's quite special to the collection, not only because it was collected by us. People around the world have come to study this, and its name has changed a few times as people learn more about it. But right now it's still Pteranodon, and yeah, it hasn't changed names yet. The most common vertebrate fossil that you're finding in the province comes from hadrosaurs. These are duck-billed dinosaurs. Okay, these are like the cows of the Cretaceous. So if you flip open the side of the jawbone, here's the surface of the teeth that were used for eating. If you turn around the back, it's called a dental battery. So you have multiple teeth here, and they're all lined up. Most reptiles and amphibians replace their teeth throughout their life. This is another example. And yeah, when you're eating grass, it has silica in it. And silica is really hard and it wears down your teeth. So whether you're a mammoth or a mastodon or these guys here, your teeth are going to get worn down. The reptiles have the advantage of being able to replace them constantly. Mammoths, elephants, those being mammals, like us, replace their teeth maybe once or twice. That's about it. So they have a different way of dealing with the hard grasses. Okay. These guys weren't eating grasses though, but they ate lots of vegetation, which would help grind down their teeth. Grasses became, and other flowering plants weren't really abundant until after the dinosaurs died out. Okay, we'll talk about that in a little bit. This was the showcase sample when the museum opened in 1935. So we've had accessible spaces since the 1920s on campus to see our fossil and rock collections, but there was an official museum opening in 1935. The first fossil collections on campus that weren't research related came from the activities of George Sternberg, who was a famous dinosaur collector, and we purchased 2 field seasons, 1920 and 1921, to start off our Alberta fossil collections. Okay, and this one wasn't prepped until the 1930s, and we needed special grant money to get our museum up and running. We got a Carnegie Museum grant, and yeah, this was a great, great display piece for Edmonton at that time. There was no other big museum in Alberta. We didn't have the Provincial Museum until 1967. The Tyrrell wasn't around until 1985. So U Alberta was the place to come see artifacts. You'll notice this funky neck shape. That's not real. If we extended it out, it wouldn't fit in the museum. Okay, so that's an artificial creation. Let's take a look at this one. It's another one of those marine reptiles. This is a Ichthyosaur. To show you how you can tell when you visit a museum what's real and what's not, let's take a quick look here. The bone that's real in front of the bum end, the bone is brown, but multi-shades of brown. It's shiny, it's cracked, definitely real bone. Look at the tail, it's a reconstruction. It's all one color. There aren't any cracks in it. And yeah, museums will usually make sure that it is noticeable which is real bone and which is not. So you'll find that on our dinosaur fossils as well, which we should go look at a couple before we wrap up. At the University of Alberta, we have one of the finest Stegosaurus specimens in the world. So if you look at the real skull that's on the bottom of the case, there are copies of that all around the world. It's still spectacular. These are cute little dome-headed dinosaurs, okay? And it's thought that they might have been using their heads for display or even for aggressive interactions like bighorn sheep do. And there has been research by Alberta researchers on that. And yeah, you can look those kind of studies up. They're really fun. Paleontology being such a public science, you can usually find a lot of information referenced to real scientific papers. So have fun. We were talking about how big things were. Okay, this is Burgess. It's Tyrannosaurus' little cousin. It was around long before Tyrannosaurus was, and it's smaller. Okay, if I had a Tyrannosaurus skeleton, the head would be almost 3-4 times the size. Okay, so much smaller, a lot of things in common, but slightly different. Somebody's going to ask me if it isn't the chat. I'm expecting it to be by the end. Do I have fossil poop? Coprolite, yes. So the vertebrate guys, the vertebrate people do have different kinds of dinosaur poop and other kinds of poop, fish poop. This is poop that comes from a lake. It's the big mass there, and then there's a little seed beside it. So that's the fossil poop that we have in the museum. I just wanted to talk about more recent things that happened after the dinosaurs. After the dinosaurs went extinct, it became drier, cooler, and then there were mammals on the landscape, pollinating insects. It looked the land turned and looked a lot different than it did at the time of dinosaurs. Alberta as a province didn't move much with plate tectonics at that time, but we were impacted by global climate changes that were taking place. And so we see, interestingly enough, we can find camels, you can find lions in the younger sediments. If you want to see more of those, definitely go visit the Royal Alberta Museum. They have a fantastic quaternary case to see all that fantastic stuff. And that's actually really most recent. We're missing a lot of chunk of history in the province from the end of the dinosaurs to today. It's a kind of a really thin layer. And so glaciers took it away. If we had rock deposit at that time, it's gone because of the glacial activity. Okay, so things that we do have in Canada that are spectacular are lake deposits. Dr. Wilson was collecting fish and other things in the environment in lakes. So you can see a water strider there. It's very similar to water striders that we have today. We do have some of those big mammals like they do at the ramp, okay? So for example, let's talk about woolly mammoths. We already talked about teeth that are great for eating vegetation. This is an example of a mammoth tooth. It's kind of like a loaf of bread, right? All lined up. And that structure is really good for grinding down grass. Another kind of tooth are the tusks. So the tusk is made of the same material as the tooth. Okay, bison. Around Edmonton, even today, and throughout the province, you can find bison skulls. It's a good idea to contact a paleontologist if you find what you think is a bison skull, especially if you're in some place where there isn't any evidence of settler or farming activity by other peoples, because it's possibly paleo bison. So if you look at the species name here, it's Bison priscus. It's a different species of bison than what we have today. Okay, So on that note, we've done our little walk of what's interesting at the museum, and we have time for 1 or 2 questions.
Yeah. So one of our attendees asked, how do you know how old the fossils are?
Okay, there are a couple of different ways. What is most common is we use relative age dating. Most of the time when people are collecting fossils, we already know a lot about the geologic history of the area, and we have a sense of how old a rock package is. So if it falls in there, we know about how old it is. Certain suites of fossils are very unique to really short periods of time, like 1 or 2 million years, and that'll give us indication that way. So that's the second way. The rarest way that we do it is to actually radiometric date the rock around the fossil, and that's where you're using like carbon dating or uranium lead dating. And yeah, those are 3 different ways.
Okay, so we're just going to do one more question. Have you ever broken a fossil before?
Yes. Okay, it's not uncommon when you're working with fossil materials that they break. So something that people don't know is that as soon as you uncover a rock or a fossil and there's no pressure on it and it starts to dry up, it becomes more fragile and brittle. Okay, so there's often cracks through every fossil in my collection someplace. And over time, if we're vibrating and carrying it across someplace on a cart, it could break apart. So the biggest one we broke and most significant was a giant trilobite from Morocco. It's actually on display in the other room, and it cracked right through the middle.
All right. Thank you, Lisa, and thank you everyone for attending the tour. Do you have any closing remarks?
Yeah. Okay, so if you would like to explore the museum, please check out the hours through the link online. You can check out this museum, the Mineralogy and Petrology Museum down the way. We also have a geoscience garden outside on Saskatchewan Drive, and there's a great companion website there. You don't even have to visit in person to know about the rocks, but you can plan your visit by downloading a tour there. And I also have QR codes on the plates, so you can see that. If you want to see other museum collections on campus, go to the University of Alberta Museums site, and there's a link to the different collections and which ones are publicly accessible. But yeah, thank you for coming by this morning, or whenever you're watching this. I've enjoyed being able to present and interact with you today.